So here we have an example of a interventionist in a good fenced position. And what we're showing here is just the different ways that we can defend ourselves from the fence. Naturally, the fence is designed to maximize and maintain distance. So our first goal should always be to stay away. And so we see here Darren using basic blocks at a distance using his forearm. What's extremely important is that he's not just blocking, but that he's moving his head and his body. I don't want to have static blocks where I'm moving and clashing force on force. Rather, I want to move off the line, and as I move, my forearm is almost like a replacement so that there's less requirement for clashing and force on force. I'm not looking to replace the possible impact to my head or body with the certain collision of my forearm against whatever's coming in. Rather, I'm looking to just kind of monitor rather than block. So he's monitoring with these outside checks. At the exact same distance, we can also monitor to the inside. We can parry and catch. And here we see examples of that. Again, notice that as Darren is parrying and catching, he's always moving his head, always moving his torso. The third and final option, if we're not parrying or monitoring out or in, is to shield. But the thing that I want you to understand about shielding is that while it is extremely effective, it is also a failure to define space. It is a collapsing of a fence. So for my opponent, it's an invitation for them to come into my space. A lot of people say shielding's so good, I'm just going to shield all the time. But if I shield in a static way, that person is just going to come all the way into my space and I've just invited them in. Whereas through movement and monitoring and parrying, I could have maintained distance. With good footwork, I could even get further away. So I shield when I have nowhere else to go. I shield when I cannot parry and dance and move around. And if I'm going to shield, at minimum, I want to be changing heights so I'm not where they expect me to be. But ideally, I should be shielding and moving in or moving out. Moving out to a safer distance, getting back to parrying and monitoring, or moving in, colliding, clashing, spiking and spearing with elbows and forearms, coming into their space and doing something with it. Taking them down, getting hands on them, controlling them. So shielding is dynamic and active, just as is parrying and monitoring with the hands. I should always be moving. One of the most overlooked aspects of a fence is that it must be alive. It must be dynamic. And as I said earlier, a fence is only as good as our ability to defend it. It's good to have a fence, better to have a fence and a shotgun to keep people off your property. You must be dynamic. If I simply put out a textbook fence and do nothing with it, then an aggressor can go right through it. Here we see an officer who's doing the exact perfect textbook photo of a fence with a retracted power side hand on his firearm. He is screaming commands. He is trying to keep the subject away. There is a backup officer. This is from the body cam of the backup officer that we're actually seeing this vantage point. And this was preceded by the officer having their weapons drawn and backpedaling, not circling, not moving, backpedaling in a straight line for the length of a street. A block and a half down to a roundabout, backing up, backing up, backing up, screaming commands, as we see here, the subject just chasing him, not respecting. At one point, a round is fired, and you'll notice if you look carefully, the subject has blood on the forearm and hand. They have been hit. To their credit, the officers are still trying to de-escalate and defuse. But what happens here is the subject is finally under the flank of one pistol drawn from officer number 1 and under the clearly defined fence of officer number 2, advancing on the second officer. He then drags that extended fence arm, gets to a back, and performs a textbook harness. Here we see the subject actually behaving in the ideal way we train our own officers to behave. If I have somebody with a weapon retracted, whether it's a drawn knife or they're going for a pistol or the gun is out and they've extended any manner of arm, we know from consistent pressure testing that it's extremely hard to get around this arm and to get to that weapon. And you have a better chance of dragging that arm off, going around the dark side of the moon to the back and controlling it. And here we see a trained officer making the cardinal mistake of having the hand on the pistol, an extended fence, but a dead fence with no willingness to defend it. He gets his arm dragged, the aggressor takes his back, gets him in a textbook harness, proceeds to wrestle for the gun. So this is a classic example of good tactics on the side of the subject and terrible imitated tactics on the side of the officer. Again, they've seen the harness, they've been introduced to it, they've seen the fence, they've seen the work, but they haven't pressure tested it. And that's why they replicate it. They were used to doing it, and then the subject just stops in their role play. The subject was never behaving as intelligently as they themselves would behave. So this is a classic example that your fence is only going to be as good as your willingness to defend it.